Imagine a town where life moves slowly, and the hustle and bustle of big city problems never seem to reach its peaceful streets. Oakwood Springs, Texas, is that town. Nestled in the heart of the Lone Star State, it is a close-knit community where neighbors greet each other with a friendly wave and where doors are left unlocked at night, a symbol of the trust that binds its residents together. Children ride their bikes down tree-lined streets, and families gather in front yards to share stories as the sun sets. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other by name, where the biggest event of the year is the annual county fair, a celebration of local traditions, food, and the simple joys of rural life. To the outside world, Oakwood Springs may seem like the epitome of tranquility, a town untouched by the worries that plague larger cities. But lurking beneath the surface of this idyllic setting was a darkness so chilling that it would shake the very core of Oakwood Springs. A crime was about to unfold, one so shocking that it would forever change how the town saw its own residents and the very idea of trust. In the quiet corners of this small town, where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary, a woman, a wife, a mother, a neighbor, was plotting an act of unimaginable desperation. This is the story of Lisa Miller, a 30-year-old woman who had everything to lose and everything to gain. On the outside, Lisa appeared to live a simple, unassuming life. She had a loving husband, 2 children, and a modest home in Oakwood Springs. She attended the local church and was well-liked by her neighbors, often offering a helping hand when needed. But beneath the surface, Lisa was grappling with a life spiraling into financial ruin. Her family was drowning in debt, and no matter how hard they tried, the bills kept piling up. Lisa felt trapped, cornered by the suffocating weight of her circumstances. In her mind, she had one option left, a way out that seemed both desperate and brilliant. And so, Lisa hatched a plan, one that would send shockwaves through her community and leave a stain on Oakwood Springs that would never wash away. In her search for a way to escape her problems, Lisa made a decision that would forever change the course of her life. She saw an opportunity in her life insurance policy, a policy worth millions that would pay out in the event of an accident. It was a grotesque idea, one that no one could have imagined coming from someone who had once seemed so kind, so harmless. But in the depths of her desperation, Lisa took a dark and dangerous turn. Lisa hired Daniel Johnson, a young man in his 20s who had recently fallen on hard times, to carry out the unthinkable. She offered him a substantial amount of money, a sum that could solve his problems, and then some, in exchange for one horrific act. Lisa asked Daniel to amputate her limbs. Not only that, but she wanted him to stage the scene to look like an accident, a gruesome and shocking accident involving a train. Lisa knew that if she could fool the insurance company into believing it was an accident, she would be the sole beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar payout. She would finally have the financial freedom she had longed for, and her family's burdens would be lifted. But how could a woman go to such extreme lengths? What drove her to make such a twisted choice, to sacrifice her own body for money? The answer lies in the darkness of human nature, the crushing weight of desperation, the lure of easy wealth, and the power of greed. Lisa saw a way out, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen, no matter the cost. The plan was set in motion on a warm summer afternoon, when Lisa and Daniel met at a secluded spot near the railroad tracks just outside Oakwood Springs. The location was chosen carefully, with a well-timed train passing by and the right conditions to make the accident seem authentic. With a sense of cold resolve, Lisa laid down on the tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She told Daniel to cut off her limbs, to make it look like she had been struck by the train. It was a twisted plan, but in her mind, it was the only way to break free from her financial nightmare. What followed was a scene of unimaginable horror. Daniel hesitated, but ultimately followed through with Lisa's chilling request. He amputated her hands and feet, each cut a devastating blow to her body and her soul. Lisa screamed in pain, but there was no turning back. She lay there, bloodied and broken, as the train approached. It was the final act in a plan so gruesome, so callous, that no one could have predicted it. But Lisa wasn't finished yet. She had one final step to complete. She had to convince everyone that this was an accident. Lisa's story would be the one everyone would believe at first. She was found near the tracks, bloodied and battered, and her story about being caught in the train's path seemed plausible. But as the investigation unfolded, the truth began to unravel. The authorities quickly discovered the inconsistencies in her story, the gaps in her alibi, and the chilling reality of her actions. The investigation led to Lisa's arrest and the shocking truth about her motive. In a small town like Oakwood Springs, where everyone knew each other, it seemed impossible that something so sinister could happen. But the crime would change Oakwood Springs forever. The peaceful town would never be the same, and the residents of this quiet place would forever be haunted by the depths of greed and the lengths to which a desperate woman was willing to go. This is the story of Lisa Miller, the woman who orchestrated a horrific crime in the name of money. It's a tale of desperation, deceit, and the devastating consequences of one woman's choices. And it's a reminder that, even in the most tranquil of places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. On the night of May 5th, 2024, the peaceful rhythms of Oakwood Springs were violently disrupted. It was just after midnight, the small town enveloped in darkness, when a phone call pierced the stillness. At exactly 12:05 a.m., Daniel Johnson, a young man from Oakwood Springs, urgently dialed 911, his voice trembling as he reported a shocking accident. A train had struck a woman near the railroad tracks. Within minutes, the town's quiet streets were filled with the distant wail of sirens, and the calm, familiar surroundings were now haunted by the grim reality of the scene. When the police arrived at the railroad tracks, they found something far more chilling than they could have anticipated. There, sitting eerily close to the steel rails, was a woman drenched in blood, her clothes saturated with the deep crimson of her injuries. The scene was one of devastation. Her left hand and foot had been grotesquely severed, torn away by the brutal force of the train. The officers expected chaos, cries for help, frantic movements, someone clearly in agony. But instead, they found an unnerving calm. The woman, who would later be identified as Lisa Miller, did not scream. She wasn't thrashing around in pain. In fact, she didn't seem to be reacting to the trauma at all. She sat there, her face pale, blood pooling beneath her as the night air grew colder. The scene was chilling, not just because of the severity of her injuries, but because of how calm she appeared. She wasn't sobbing, she wasn't panicking, or even attempting to move. She simply sat there, her eyes glazed, as if in some detached trance. When the officers approached her, the sight was almost surreal. Her breaths were shallow, but deliberate. There was no frantic plea for help, no desperate attempt to stop the bleeding or take cover. Instead, when asked what had happened, she explained in a quiet, almost resigned tone, "I was walking along the tracks, lost in thought. I must have been distracted, and the train, it hit me." Her words were strange and matter-of-fact, not fitting the gravity of the horrific injuries she had sustained. Lisa's calm demeanor didn't match the expected response. It was as if she were telling a story rather than recounting a traumatic event. The officers, trained to recognize the emotional chaos of such accidents, couldn't shake the discomfort that settled in their stomachs. Something wasn't right. There was no hysteria, no flailing arms, no cries of pain or confusion. She wasn't even attempting to stop the bleeding. Instead, she sat there, seemingly detached from the reality of her situation. Why wasn't she panicking? Why wasn't she writhing in pain? The questions began to bubble up in the minds of the investigators, lingering and unanswered. Lisa had been struck by a train, a violent, life-threatening event, and yet she seemed oddly composed, as if the horror of the accident hadn't quite reached her mind. As the paramedics arrived, their eyes narrowed as they assessed the scene. They quickly moved her away from the tracks, stabilizing her injuries as best as they could before rushing her to the hospital. Lisa's lifeless stare and unsettling silence persisted as they worked to save her. The doctors, too, would be faced with the grim reality of her injuries, but as they prepared for surgery, they too were puzzled by the woman who didn't seem to be in as much pain as one would expect. The officers couldn't help but feel something was off. As the initial shock of the scene wore off, suspicion began to creep into their minds. Why had Lisa been walking along the tracks so late at night, alone, with no clear reason for being there? Why wasn't she more distressed? The lack of panic was so striking that it overshadowed even the severity of her injuries. As the case unfolded, those questions began to take on new urgency. Was it possible that something more sinister had occurred here? Lisa Miller's story seemed simple enough at first. A woman lost in thought, a tragic accident. But the calmness of her reaction, the strange detachment in the face of such agony, planted the seed of doubt in the minds of the investigators. They knew they needed to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface of the apparent accident. Lisa Miller's story, it seemed, was only just beginning to unravel. What the officers didn't know then was that Oakwood Springs was about to be thrust into a web of lies, deception, and a crime so twisted that it would leave the small town reeling for years to come. As the investigation into the train incident continued, detectives began to notice unsettling discrepancies in Lisa Miller's account. From the very beginning, something about her story didn't add up. She claimed that she had been struck by a speeding train while walking along the tracks. Yet her behavior at the scene was anything but typical for someone who had just survived such a harrowing accident. Rather than displaying the expected panic or pain, Lisa remained disturbingly calm. The blood staining her clothes and pooling around her body told the story of someone severely injured, but her lack of distress was deeply troubling to the detectives. Even more puzzling were the details of her injuries. The train had supposedly hit her with full force, but the severity and nature of the wounds didn't align with the way she described the accident. While it was true that her left hand and foot had been gruesomely severed, the injuries seemed oddly selective. The trauma didn't match the chaotic aftermath one would expect from a train collision. The officers had seen similar cases of train accidents, but none had been as inconsistent as Lisa's. It was as though she had been injured in a controlled, deliberate way, almost as if the injuries had been staged. Detectives started to piece together the puzzle, and the more they dug, the more suspicious her story became. Lisa's calm demeanor, combined with the strange details of her account, led them to believe that something far more sinister was at play. They began to investigate her background, looking for any clues that could explain the oddities surrounding the incident. As they dug deeper, what they uncovered was shocking. Lisa Miller was not the woman she appeared to be. In fact, she wasn't alone in this web of deceit. The young man who had reported the incident, Daniel Johnson, was far more involved than anyone had initially realized. It turned out that Daniel and Lisa weren't just casual acquaintances. They had a secret connection, and their relationship was far from innocent. The detectives discovered that the two had been planning the incident for months. It wasn't a tragic accident at all. It was a cold and calculated scheme. They had orchestrated the entire event, carefully crafting a plan to stage Lisa's accident in the hopes of cashing in on a life insurance policy worth an astonishing $3.5 million. The plot was chilling in its simplicity. Lisa would be struck by the train, severely injured but alive, and then they would collect the insurance payout. To make the accident appear more convincing, they had staged the scene with meticulous detail. They had chosen the location carefully, near the railroad tracks, in an area that seemed remote but not too far from the town, allowing Lisa to be found by a passerby. They had even planned how to ensure that Lisa would remain conscious and appear disoriented, but not in distress. The lack of panic was part of their plan, designed to make the scene look more like a tragic accident than a carefully orchestrated crime. What made the plot even more disturbing was the role Daniel had played. Daniel Johnson, the young man who had so innocently called 911, had been paid to assist in the execution of the plan. He had been hired by Lisa to carry out the gruesome task of severing her limbs in a way that would make the injuries look like the aftermath of a train collision. For his role in the scheme, Daniel had been promised a substantial payout, money that would change his life. Lisa, too, stood to gain immensely, her financial troubles erased with the stroke of a pen and the payout from the life insurance policy. The two of them had been driven by desperation and greed, willing to go to any lengths to secure their financial futures. But as the investigators continued to uncover more about the two conspirators, they found themselves confronting the darker side of human nature. What had driven Lisa to such extremes? Was it purely financial hardship, or was there something more at play? Something deeper, more personal? And what about Daniel? What had convinced him to take part in such a horrific plot? As they dug further into their relationship, the detectives began to see just how far Lisa and Daniel were willing to go for money, no matter the cost. The truth of the matter was now clear. This wasn't a simple accident. It was a gruesome, calculated attempt to defraud an insurance company. But the consequences of their actions were far-reaching. The damage they had caused wasn't just financial. It was emotional and psychological. Oakwood Springs, a town that had always prided itself on its close-knit, trusting community, was now reeling from the shock of betrayal. The very fabric of trust had been ripped apart, and the quiet town would never be the same again. Lisa Miller's life had taken a dark turn. Once a woman with dreams of a bright future, she found herself ensnared in a web of financial despair. Her debts were mounting, bills piling up, and her once promising future now seemed impossible to achieve. The weight of her financial troubles became all-consuming, and she found herself desperate for a way out. But it was in this desperation that a dark idea began to take root. Lisa, feeling cornered and hopeless, concocted a plan so macabre that it would leave the entire town in disbelief. She decided that the only way to escape her financial nightmare was to fake her own death. It wasn't just about disappearing. She needed a way to ensure her debts were erased, her future secured. And that, she realized, could only happen if she staged a gruesome accident that would guarantee her a life insurance payout. The plan she devised was chilling in its detail and ruthlessness. Lisa would stage an accident that would make it appear as if she had been struck by a train, her body left mangled and nearly unrecognizable. But to pull this off, she needed help, someone who could assist in carrying out the grisly task. And that's where Daniel Johnson entered the picture. Daniel, a young man who had been struggling to make ends meet, was no stranger to financial hardship. He lived in the same small town, Oakwood Springs, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet no one could have imagined how deep his own desperation ran. When Lisa approached him with her plan, promising him $50,000 for his assistance, Daniel saw it as the opportunity of a lifetime. His debts, too, were overwhelming, and the offer was one he simply couldn't refuse. With money as his motivation, Daniel agreed to help Lisa carry out her twisted scheme. He knew it was wrong, but the thought of finally being able to pay off his debts, to have the freedom he longed for, clouded his judgment. He immediately set about preparing for the deed. He purchased a large, sharp knife, one capable of carrying out the gruesome task Lisa had outlined. He carefully scouted the location, choosing an area near the railroad tracks, where a train would pass by at a predictable time, ensuring the accident would look real. This wasn't just about cutting off her limbs. It was about creating a believable scene that would make the life insurance claim appear legitimate. The night was set. Lisa, dressed in dark clothes to avoid being spotted by anyone who might question her presence, positioned herself carefully near the tracks, waiting for Daniel to arrive. The two of them knew that what they were about to do would change their lives forever, but they also believed it was their only way out. Lisa took a deep breath and steeled herself for what was about to come. She had spent so long rehearsing the details in her mind. Now it was time to bring the nightmare to life. As the train neared in the distance, Lisa gave Daniel the instructions he needed. She directed him to sever her foot first, knowing that the brutal act would cause the train's passing to seem more believable. Then, once her foot was nearly severed, she asked him to move on to her hand. With each cut, she could feel her body going numb, but she stayed focused on the end game, the payout from her life insurance policy that would set her free from her debts and allow her to start new. In the seconds before the train's arrival, Lisa's thoughts raced. She had planned every detail meticulously, but there was one thing she couldn't predict: the rush of panic that would course through her veins as the train came closer. As the massive locomotive thundered toward her, she fought to keep her composure. She had to be convincing. She couldn't let Daniel or anyone else see her doubt. This was her only shot at freedom. The train screamed by, and as Lisa lay there, blood soaking her clothes, her body left in a broken heap on the tracks, she knew that the next steps were crucial. If she could survive this, the insurance payout would be worth millions, money that would take her far away from Oakwood Springs, away from the life that had suffocated her for so long. Daniel, now in a state of shock from the grotesque act he had just carried out, quickly snapped into action. The plan had to be followed through. He ran to the nearest phone, calling 911 to report the accident. He described the scene to the dispatcher, trying to sound convincing. The town would soon be flooded with police and emergency responders. The train had done its part in the narrative, and now it was time for the real drama to unfold. The drama that would forever change the course of both their lives. But as the investigation progressed, the chilling truth would begin to emerge. The accident was no accident at all. Lisa and Daniel had crossed a line they could never return from. And what had seemed like a way out of their financial troubles was about to unravel in the most horrifying of ways. Lisa's plan had seemed foolproof, a meticulously orchestrated scheme that promised her the financial freedom she had longed for. With her limbs severed in the most convincing manner possible, all that remained was the final step: collect the payout from her life insurance policy. But as the days went by, the authorities began to unravel the layers of deception that Lisa had so carefully constructed. From the moment the first responders arrived at the scene, something fell off. Lisa, despite her horrific injuries, remained eerily calm. She wasn't frantically calling out for help, nor was she in shock as one would expect someone who had just been run over by a train. Instead, she sat there, blood soaking through her clothes, as if she were merely waiting for someone to find her. The calmness in her demeanor didn't match the chaos of her injuries, raising the first red flag in an investigation that would soon reveal its darkest secrets. Sheriff Emily Daniels, a seasoned officer who had seen her fair share of accidents in Oakwood Springs, could not ignore the strange circumstances surrounding Lisa's case. Something wasn't right from the start, she admitted to her colleagues during one of the initial briefings. I've handled hundreds of calls, but this one, it didn't add up. There was too much calm, too much control in her actions. It felt like she was waiting for something to happen rather than being a victim of it. As investigators dug deeper, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The injuries Lisa sustained weren't consistent with being struck by a train. The positioning of her body, the lack of any visible damage to the areas that would normally be impacted by such an accident, suggested that the train was not the cause of her injuries at all. The more they looked into the scene, the more they began to suspect foul play. The breakthrough came when investigators began to dig into Lisa's background and financial situation. It didn't take long for them to discover that Lisa had recently purchased a life insurance policy worth $3.5 million. A payout of that magnitude would have been life-changing for someone like Lisa, who had been struggling financially for years. What they found next only deepened the mystery. Lisa had been facing mounting debts and was in desperate need of a way to erase her financial troubles. But it wasn't just her personal debts that raised suspicion. It was her connection to Daniel Johnson, the young man who had been the first to report the incident. The two had known each other for years, and as investigators delved into their relationship, they discovered that Lisa had enlisted Daniel's help in executing the gruesome plan. She had paid him $50,000 to sever her limbs and stage the scene of a train accident. Daniel, also struggling with financial woes, had seen this as a chance to solve his own problems. It became clear that this wasn't just a botched accident. It was a deliberate act of fraud. Lisa and Daniel had worked together to fake her death, intending to claim the massive insurance payout that would follow. The chilling reality of their scheme hit the investigators hard. Not only had Lisa gone to unimaginable lengths to harm herself, but she had also involved an innocent man, Daniel, in a crime that would cost him far more than he ever anticipated. Sheriff Emily Daniels, speaking to the press after the truth had been revealed, couldn't hide her disbelief. We've heard of similar incidents abroad, where people have gone to extreme lengths to claim insurance payouts, but nothing like this has ever happened here, in Oakwood Springs. The audacity of it all is staggering. Lisa Miller staged this horrific scene, and if she had succeeded, she would have walked away with $3.5 million, money that would have come at the expense of her own limbs and, potentially, an innocent man's life. As the story began to spread throughout the small town of Oakwood Springs, the community was left reeling. For years, Lisa had been a familiar face in the neighborhood, always friendly and approachable, someone everyone thought they knew. But now, it became clear that the woman they had trusted was capable of far darker things than anyone could have imagined. Lisa's calm demeanor and the carefully constructed web of lies she had spun seemed like the actions of someone who had lost all sense of morality, willing to sacrifice everything, including her own body, to escape the crushing weight of her debts. The case would go down in history as one of the most bizarre and chilling acts of fraud ever to take place in Oakwood Springs. For Lisa, the consequences would be severe. She had not only failed in her attempt to defraud the insurance company, but also destroyed her own life in the process. And for Daniel, the reality of his involvement would soon set in. What had seemed like an opportunity for financial relief had turned into a nightmare neither of them could escape. As the investigation progressed, the town watched in shock as their once beloved neighbor was exposed for the criminal she had become. The truth had come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. After weeks of painstaking investigation, the truth behind the horrific train accident staged by Lisa Miller and Daniel Johnson finally came to light. Both were arrested, their lives irrevocably changed, and the dark secrets they had tried so desperately to conceal were exposed for all to see. The confession came quickly, almost as if the weight of their own actions had begun to suffocate them. Lisa, the mastermind behind the plot, admitted to everything with a chilling calmness. She laid out the details of the scheme with cold precision, recounting how she had orchestrated the entire plan, hiring Daniel to sever her limbs and then stage the scene of the accident, all in an effort to claim the $3.5 million life insurance payout. Lisa's admission was a striking contrast to the serene, almost composed woman the town of Oakwood Springs had known for years. She had been the epitome of kindness and generosity, always ready to lend a helping hand, to volunteer at local events, and to be a listening ear for anyone in need. To the people of Oakwood Springs, Lisa was a woman who had it all: a loving family, a supportive husband, and a life that seemed full of promise. How could someone who appeared to have everything, who had built a life that many others envied, descend to such desperate and dark extremes? As Lisa recounted the chilling details, she spoke of the mounting pressure she had felt under the weight of her mounting debts. The reality of her financial struggles had begun to eat away at her, and the opportunity for a quick fix had presented itself in the most sinister of ways. The idea of faking her own death had begun to take root in her mind, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her financial situation spiraled out of control. The allure of a life insurance policy worth millions was too much to resist, and Lisa became convinced that she could deceive the system and everyone around her to get the money she so desperately needed. The role that Daniel Johnson played in her plot was equally chilling. Daniel, a young man from Oakwood Springs who had grown up in a financially struggling household, saw an opportunity for himself in Lisa's desperation. She had offered him $50,000 to help her sever her limbs and stage the scene of the accident, an amount that seemed like a small fortune to someone like Daniel. He had struggled to make ends meet, just like so many others in the town, and the offer seemed too good to refuse. But when it came time to carry out the gruesome act, Daniel was forced to confront the reality of what he was about to do. The knife he had purchased became an instrument of destruction, cutting through not just Lisa's body, but the very moral fabric of both their lives. Daniel's confession was filled with remorse and guilt, yet there was an unmistakable sense of responsibility in his words. He knew that he had made a terrible mistake, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What had started as an opportunity to improve his financial situation had turned into an unimaginable tragedy. His actions had forever changed the lives of everyone involved, not least of all his own. The weight of the consequences of their plan settled heavily on him as he recounted the events. He had not been the mastermind, but he had carried out the gruesome task of cutting off Lisa's limbs, all for the promise of money. He, too, had been driven by desperation and greed, but the horror of what he had done was now unmistakable. The arrest sent shockwaves through Oakwood Springs, a small town where everyone knew each other, and the most scandalous thing in recent memory had been a local football game gone awry. Lisa Miller, once the beloved figure who attended every town meeting and helped organize events, had suddenly become the face of betrayal and deception. The townspeople could hardly fathom the truth. How could someone they had trusted for so many years, the woman who had always been so kind and so generous, have been capable of such a cold, calculated act of fraud? The whispers started slowly, then grew louder, as the townspeople tried to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the criminal who had been arrested. How had she fallen so far? How had the woman with so much to lose been driven to destroy her own life and body for money? For the people of Oakwood Springs, the arrest was not just a shock. It was a complete betrayal. They had seen Lisa as one of their own, someone they admired, someone who seemed to have everything. But behind the facade of the perfect life, there had been a woman so desperate and consumed by her own financial woes that she was willing to sacrifice everything, including her own limbs and the trust of everyone around her, to escape her problems. The news spread quickly, and the once quiet town was left reeling. No one could have imagined that Lisa, the woman they had all known and loved, could be capable of such an unimaginable act of desperation and greed. As Lisa and Daniel's confessions were made public, the town of Oakwood Springs began to grapple with the harsh reality of the crime that had shaken them to their core. The lives of the people involved, Lisa, Daniel, and their families, would never be the same again. The once beautiful tapestry of Oakwood Springs had been torn apart, and its residents would forever remember the chilling truth of what had happened in their quiet town. As Lisa Miller and Daniel Johnson faced their charges, the small town of Oakwood Springs was gripped by a collective disbelief that rippled through the community. For years, Lisa had been the epitome of success and charm, widely admired for her warmth, generosity, and unwavering dedication to the town. She had been a role model for many, a symbol of how hard work and a kind heart could lead to a fulfilling life. But now, standing accused of an unimaginable crime, she had become the very face of betrayal and deceit. The woman once regarded as the shining example of small-town success was now the subject of national headlines for trying to orchestrate her own death for a $3.5 million insurance payout. The truth of Lisa's actions shook Oakwood Springs to its core. People who had known her for years, who had called her a friend, could hardly come to grips with the reality of her crime. How could someone who seemed to have it all, the loving family, the successful career, and the respect of the community, be capable of such a horrific, calculated plot? How could a woman who appeared so perfect, who had everything going for her, descend into a world of deception and manipulation so dark? The answers were hard to come by, and many were left to wonder. What kind of desperation could drive a person to such extremes? Lisa's case became a cautionary tale, a sharp reminder of the lengths to which people might go when they are consumed by the lure of easy money. The investigation revealed that Lisa's carefully constructed life was nothing more than a facade. Behind the scenes, she had been struggling with mounting debt and a sense of hopelessness that she had tried desperately to hide. The financial strain she was under, combined with the allure of a large life insurance payout, had led her down a path that no one could have imagined. The woman who had once been admired for her kindness and generosity had planned to destroy everything she had worked for, including her own body, in a desperate attempt to escape her financial troubles. Lisa had sacrificed her limbs, her dignity, and the trust of everyone around her for the promise of a quick and easy solution. It was a level of desperation that shocked her friends, family, and neighbors. But the story doesn't end with Lisa's betrayal. Daniel Johnson, too, found himself caught in the devastating consequences of his actions. A young man who had once struggled to make ends meet, Daniel had been lured into Lisa's plan by the promise of $50,000, money that, to him, seemed like a lifeline. He had been convinced that helping her carry out this gruesome act would bring him the financial relief he had always wanted. But when it was all over, Daniel was left to face the grim reality of what he had done. He wasn't just an accomplice in a crime. He was a young man whose choices had irrevocably altered the course of his life. In the days that followed, Daniel struggled with his role in the plot, wrestling with guilt and regret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Oakwood Springs, a community once filled with trust, unity, and close-knit relationships, now found itself torn apart. The whispers and suspicions had taken root, and the town's idyllic image had been shattered. The residents who once saw Lisa as a friend, a neighbor, and a role model now looked at her with disbelief. What had happened to the woman they thought they knew? What had pushed her to the brink of such an unfathomable decision? And, perhaps most importantly, what did this reveal about the nature of greed and desperation? The case of Lisa and Daniel served as a grim reminder that no one is truly immune from making choices that could alter their lives forever. It raised difficult questions about the price of greed and the ways in which desperation can cloud one's judgment, pushing individuals to make decisions that are both morally and ethically reprehensible. It also served as a reminder of the fragility of trust, the way that even the most trusted and admired people can harbor secrets that, when exposed, change everything. In the aftermath of this case, Oakwood Springs began to heal, though it would never be the same. The residents became more vigilant, more aware of the potential dangers lurking beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. They began to question their assumptions and to look more closely at the people they trusted. And while the town may never fully recover from the trauma that this case caused, it will undoubtedly emerge stronger and wiser, more mindful of the complexities of human nature and the ways in which even the most idyllic communities can be vulnerable to deception and betrayal. Lisa's story, as tragic and shocking as it was, provides a valuable lesson in the destructive power of greed and the lengths to which people will go to satisfy their desires. It is a cautionary tale for us all, reminding us that no matter how perfect things may seem on the surface, there's always more lurking beneath. And as for Daniel, he will carry the weight of his actions with him for the rest of his life. In the end, both he and Lisa learned, perhaps too late, that the cost of greed is far greater than any financial gain it might promise. Thank you for watching this gripping true crime story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that delve into the darkest corners of human behavior. If this story left you questioning the darkest sides of human nature, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories that dive deep into shocking betrayals, tragedies, and the consequences of hidden secrets. Join us as we explore the twisted tales that reveal the true complexity of humanity. Subscribe now and stay tuned for new content.